Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is a computer-generated reading of Suicide Note by Mitchell Heisman. This work is free and licensed by Mitchell Heisman for copying and distribution under a Creative Commons Attribution Non-Commercial No Derivative Works 3.0 United States license. Erasing Race, Enlightened Ethnic Cleansing. The German historians Alien Heim once described Nazi plans for the ethnic cleansing of Slavic peoples in lands east of Germany as demographic engineering by resettlement or systematic extermination. The Nazis, in their view, attempted to create a tabula rasa upon which they could design a new European order. 1393 To associate ethnic cleansing with Locke's tabula rasa was, of course, deliberate comic irony. Everyone knows, after all, that the tabula rasa or blank slate is utterly incompatible with Nazi ethnic cleansing. The tabula rasa has no biological basis, right? The very act of devising the notion that there is a slate that needs to be cleaned is the hand that indelibly stains it. Behind the clean slate, behind the need for erasure of a race problem, is a race problem. Just as the imagined tabula rasa of North America was cleansed with genocidal treatment of the natives, the purity of American ideals were polished to a shine with the enlightened ethnic cleansing of the Norman legacy. George Orwell once said, "Who controls the past controls the future." Just as the conquest establishment allowed the Normans to master the interpretation of the Anglo-Saxon past in medieval times, modern democratic revolution was the great opportunity to master the Norman past. After defeating the South's Norman-based aristocracy in the American Civil War, the low-key North was in a position to shape American destiny. Lincoln the Conqueror's mastery of the South's aristocracy represented an unparalleled dishonor for all Normanity. Unspoken embarrassment about Norman aristocratic identity after the failure of the peculiar revolution created a genealogical vacuum that Northerners filled with an implicit Anglo-Saxonization of American history. By controlling the interpretation of the past, the North controlled the American vision of the future. What actually happened in that distant past? What were the consequences of 1066? Did it matter if the Norman conquerors perpetuated hereditary disconnectedness with the conquered? There is a contradiction of truly fantastic proportions between the treatment of hereditary connections between Normans and Saxons as groups, and the treatment of the individual hereditary claim made by William the Conqueror in 1066. On one hand, it is often implicitly assumed that hereditary connections between Normans and Saxons as groups did not matter in 1066. On the other hand, the import given to a single hereditary connection by William was so powerful, apparently, that it could be used to justify the invasion, military confrontation, and takeover of an entire nation. So did kinship or hereditary connections between the conquerors and the conquered matter? The conquerors had a vested interest in the way this question was answered. If hereditary connections did matter to the common people, it could potentially destabilize or even delegitimize the entire political order in the form of ethnic conflict. If hereditary connections did not matter to the common people, it could potentially destabilize or delegitimize the entire political order by questioning its very principles of hereditary rule. So whether hereditary connections to Norman conquerors did or did not matter to the conquered, either response could lead to revolutionary consequences. What one can discern in the modern, revolution-inspiring, low-key tabula rasa is a public claim that hereditary connections to the old hereditary government did not matter, that subtly covers up the opposite socio-biological reality of ethnic conflict, in which hereditary connections between the conquerors and conquered did matter. From 1066, to the Puritan Revolution, to the American Revolution, and even after the American Civil War, Normans and Saxons had to live with one another in war or in peace. If they were to live with one another in peace, only a denial of ethnic conflict and its implications could make the system work. Because kinship relations did matter, in order to both account for kinship and peaceably live together, society had to be organized, to some extent, as if kinship did not matter. In this way, one can see that ethnic conflict between Normans and Saxons is what produced the liberal democratic, end of history ethos of post-ethnic conflict peace. American political equality was more a negative statement than a positive statement. It was more, all men are not created unequal, than, all men are created equal. It was an answer in the negative as to whether there should be an assumption of hereditary or kinship relations on a political level. The factors pumped out by modern egalitarianism are biological factors, i.e. kinship factors. Modern political reductionism achieves its reduction by subtracting biological kinship factors from its formal political equations. The modern logic of reducing the socio-biological to the sociological was made rational by emphasizing the lack of ground for assuming that kinship or heredity matters. It was fundamentally negative in the sense that it was an assertion that kinship relations do not matter on the political level. The anti-kin selective ethic of Christian family values also gave a moral reason why ethnic kinship relations should not be important. The formal political negation of assumptions of kinship or hereditary connections is what vaulted universal individualism as the modern positive assumption. The American paradox wherein race both does and does not matter can be traced the condition in which Northern Anglo-Saxons and Southern Norman aristocrats could forge a founding and internal peace only through the moral principle that ethnic kinship relations should not be important on the political level. The brothers Frankenborg invented a political machine by civilizing an internal state of civil war. Internal peace required that organic, hereditary relations should not matter on a political level. In other words, the positive, descriptive assertion that there is an ethnic or hereditary problem led to the negative prescriptive solution that there should not be an ethnic hereditary problem. Much Lockean confounding of nature and nurture comes from confusing the prescriptive wish with a descriptive perception of reality. America is a consequence of this confounding of the descriptive and prescriptive interpretations of the tabula rasa. Locke's clean slate has another prescriptive aspect, a puritanical wish of some Anglo-Saxons to purify or purge themselves of the Norman contribution to their civilization. Locke's Puritan father fought in the English Civil War, and this background helps one understand the secularization of religious conceptions inherent in Americanism. From this view, the clean slate can be viewed as the apotheosis of Puritan Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism in the sense that, if the clean slate is the ruling principle of liberal democracy, it formally purges the inheritance of hereditary Norman rule. The clean slate is evidence of a Puritan wish for purification of hereditary Norman rule over Anglo-Saxons. This modern conquest of nature was an unnatural conquest of the conquest. The tabula rasa could be viewed as a pinnacle of Puritan thought and ethnocentrically Anglo-Saxon purification of the genealogical stain of the conquest through enlightened ethnic cleansing. The clean slate was also a rebuttal of the proposition that the caste consequences of the conquest were genetically determined. A bias towards nurture over nature is perfectly understandable in this Anglo-Saxon context. 4. Conservatism, in the sense of group self-preservation, would implicate the systematic perpetuation of Anglo-Saxon status. Norman property forever. Conservation of the conquest order would mean that, like yoked cattle, this beaten breed would be indelibly branded as Norman property for life, and the lives of their descendants. The ultimate Anglo-Saxon victory in the American Civil War, while serving as an effective technology of brand removal, nonetheless bears ancient palimpsest markings through a residual cultural fear of government. 17th-century Englishman Thomas Taine believed that his parents had been impoverished through the tyrannical power reigning in the Norman yoke. 1394. In this belief one can discern both the Anglo-Saxon motive to overthrow the Norman yoke in the English Civil War, and a historical root of the Lockean belief in nurture over nature. The poverty of Tanway's parents was the product, not of heredity, but of circumstantial injustice. The American cultural proclivity towards nurturism originated, not so much from a factual assessment of heredity versus environmental influences, but in a bias that gave the environment the benefit of the doubt. One should not trust the Norman verdict of Anglo-Saxon inferiority any more than one should trust the verdicts of Norman lawyers. By reversing Norman claims of their historic importance, This enlightened ethnic cleansing has inflicted one of the Anglo-Saxons' greatest acts of revenge. What does it matter if Anglo-Saxon democracy really expressed the desire to replace Norman leaders with their own hereditary representatives? Is that what the enlightened cunning of democracy was really originally all about? The elimination of aristocracy was inseparable from ethnic cleansing, and the clean slate helped exterminate the hereditary authority of the past. Whether one calls it tradition, class, or otherwise, the English constitutional order established in 1066 institutionalized Norman kin selective behavior and de facto hereditary principle. The theoretical apartheid between culture and biology behind Locke's liberal state is reverse discrimination against that traditional English hereditary discrimination. The blank slate is really a palimpsest that has superficially obscured the ancient writing inherited beneath the surface. The paradoxical origin of Lockean nurturism in enlightened ethnic cleansing is precisely the genius of the tabula rasa. Yet under the pretense of liberal superiority, people continue to be duped by its origins in ethnic conflict, especially those who want to be duped by its superficial and naive presentation of human nature. These pretenses of liberal superiority often amount to parodies of the Anglo-Saxon supremacism achieved by ethnically cleansing their hereditary Norman enemy from the historical record. Enlightened ethnic cleansing through the cleaning of the slate was the Anglo-Saxon way of modern Machiavellianism. Those take Locke's authority in sustaining the clean slate myth are mindless collaborators in Anglo-Saxon enlightened ethnic cleansing. Chapter break. From forefathers to the race fallacy. Back to main text. Can anyone actually believe in the idea of equality in a logically consistent way? If human equality is superior, then racism is not equal, but inferior to equality. Yet the inferiority of racism is partly understandable in light of the inferiority of the concept of race itself as a means of comprehending socio-biological realities. Could it be that the concept of race survives because it is so inept at fully describing the biological realities we observe, in order to dismiss the whole politically volatile issue by kicking around, beating up, and bullying this poor and feeble concept of race? Some can feel superior to it, but in reality, they are only picking on a small fry of biological explanation. Race is too crude and primitive to most fully understand even the phenomenon of racism. It is too crude, for example, to most fully comprehend the Norman-Saxon conflict. Kin selection, by grasping the problem at the roots of human nature, provides tools of sufficient precision and subtlety to finally illuminate the centuries-old controversy in a way that was previously not possible. Unlike the concept of race, the dynamics of kinship can extend from the microscopic relationship between members of a human family to more macroscopic relationships, such as that between a human and bread mold, or a chimpanzee and a squid. However, the concept of race is not completely meaningless, and I do apply the term to some populations as a generalization when I think it is mostly applicable. The kinship roots of racial prejudice are to be found, for example, in the nepotistic preference for one's biological child over a non-biological child. Political patriarchy takes the general family principle of special preference for kin over non-kin and extends it to preference for one's own polity over other polities. In its extreme form, it extends from the family to fascism, from the mafia to Mussolini. However, the less radical idea that the family points to the political, or that the political should be the perfection of the family, is classical normality. Yet Anglo-Saxon modernity is characterized by the rejection of a connection between the family, and the extension of its kinship logic towards the political. There is a logical, historical reason for this. The original difference between a native Anglo-Saxon aristocracy and the imposed Norman aristocracy was the difference between forefathers and forefathers. The social construct of human rights originally served Anglo-Saxon inclusive fitness by fighting the exploitative consequences of Norman inclusive fitness. Rights opposed duties and weakened the claims of the government of forefathers over the lives of the majority. The 19th century conservative German historian Heinrich von Treitschke, by contrast, thought, the Aboriginal family must be allowed to be the original state, for already we discover in the family the political principle of subordination. 1395. From this view, The patriarchal family provides a socio-biological model for the nation-state. Treitschke drew, from the family, socio-biological implications that culminate in the nation-state. This logic was inapplicable to the Anglo-Saxon for specific, historical reasons. The Norman conquest posed the model of subjugation, rather than subordination, and hence a kinship breakdown between the family and the state. For this perfectly understandable reason, skepticism regarding the extension of family principles towards the state eventually became traditional. Thomas Paine demonstrated this perception of separation between the state and society in The Rights of Man, 1791. Governments arise, either out of the people, or over the people. The English government is one of those which arose out of conquest, and not out of society, and consequently it arose over the people, and though it has been much modified from the opportunity of circumstances since the time of William the Conqueror, the country has never yet regenerated itself, and is therefore without a constitution. Whereas Treitschke derived the state out of the family, the English state was imposed over Anglo-Saxon families. Treitschke's assumptions did not hold for the Anglo-Saxons. The flip side of the American ethos of individual self-reliance is a relative lack of trust or belief in the more politically conservative extensions of kinship such as political patriarchy and race. From the historical experience of class cleavage, one can discern the Anglo-Saxon assumption of a discontinuity between the sub-political family and its kinship extensions on a political level. This is an influential origin of the modernistic rejection of extending kinship biological assumptions out from primitive units such as the family, and towards more developed social political implications. An individualistic, puritanical moral resistance to political authority evolved from this profound ambivalence towards political patriarchy. Paradoxically, resisting the political extensions of kinship reinforced Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism by emphasizing the sub-political, democratic body. This condition also helped produce the further paradox of the simultaneous nationalism and universalism of modern revolution. This ironic ethnocentrism is also a major source of a cultural bias against sociobiology. The universalization of Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism is detectable in a traditional distinction between kinism, i.e. the family, and racism, withholding the assumption of kinship extension to the political level generalized into an intermediary gap between kinship and race. In other words, the adaptation of Anglo-Saxon inclusive fitness to the conditions of the Norman graft resulted in limiting biological kinship assumptions so that they do not extend or generalize too far into larger grouping of the social. The key idea here is that the historic chasm between the Anglo-Saxon family and the Norman political sphere implicated an analogous chasm between kinship and race and a general resistance to socio-biological generalizations. The universalization of forefathers into the race fallacy is itself a faux universalization of Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism. Skepticism towards Norman forefathers universalized into skepticism towards patriarchy in general, until Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism generalized into universal individualism. The Hobbesian individualism that became the solution to this historical experience implicated all forms socio-biological classifications, from black slaves to women, and beyond. The liberation of women, for example, was a logical extension of Anglo-Saxon rejection of feminine caste and secondary role. Just as a traditional woman submits to a man in the patriarchal family, Anglo-Saxon ethnic identity submitted for centuries to their Norman masters. Democracy is a form of feminism, a revolution against that Norman-based political patriarchy. The feminism of individual women was implicit from the very beginning in the principles established by America's founding feminists. The English class system originated as a de facto ethnic kinship classification system, and individual feminism continues the same rebellion against a hereditary division of labor, a universalization of the Anglo-Saxon perception of false classification. The Anglo-Saxon male pride that refused to admit the feminine nature of their democracy provided the political ground for individuals of the female sex to reject their own feminine nature. Anglo-Saxon femocrats and individual feminists have converged in the attempt to reject, weaken, or reinterpret the evolutionary origins of socio-biological difference. Anglo-Saxons are heirs of forefathers who failed in their duty to defend the borders of their gene pool and their native culture. From their forefathers, the Anglo-Saxons inherited a failure to defend the collective integrity of their nation. From partial adaptation to this failure stemmed an Anglo-Saxon tradition of liberal openness that is now the pride of America. From the American inheritance of the failure of Anglo-Saxon political patriarchy evolved the further deconstruction of familial patriarchy. Liberation of women fulfills Anglo-Saxon loss of socio-biological self-control, which ultimately means loss of control over gene propagation, loss of control over biological evolution itself. But this is comprehensible only to those who do not close their minds to the application of biological evolution to human societies. Chapter break. The root of modern reason. Back to main text. The distinctively modern claim to a rational science of politics is built on the premise of the individual. At the root of reason is an ethnic kinship conflict. The condition of the original claims of political enlightenment is selective ignorance of the socio-biological origins of enlightenment. The foundation of freedom is the repression of biology. The bedrock upholding the individual premise of modern political rationalism is Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity. The liberal Anglo-Saxon bias against sociobiology can be viewed as a form of selective stupidity because its consequence is the perpetuation of a formal blindness to empirically observable phenomenon. Americans often interpret this positively as blind justice. Yet if people were literally equal, they would be literally the same and undistinguishable. To not generalize about generally observable differences among groups amounts to a stunting or thwarting of an intelligent understanding of human diversity, whether such differences are attributable to biology or not. Consequently, attacks on reason, discriminations and generalizations are attacks on reason itself. If one is to inquire freely into all things, there is no reason to presuppose either an exclusively individual perspective or an exclusively groupist perspective. Western rational inquiry has rested on the intellectual facility of analysis through the discrimination of differences. In the case of race or sex differences, the faculty of discrimination is denied, thus revealing the intellectual blind spot of the political system that makes claims of intellectual freedom. The political rejection of the intellectual faculty of analytic discrimination through socio-biological categorization stems, in part, from an Anglo-Saxon perception of false classification. Within the English class system, Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity is most developed in the American branch of the English-speaking world. It is stupid relative to the general level of intelligence the Anglo-Saxons have demonstrated in other fields of endeavor, not relative to other populations. Hence, it is a selective stupidity characteristic of the Anglo-Saxon population. Only Jews have a genuinely higher, selective stupidity quotient. The prime root of the selective de-emphasis of biological factors among Anglo-Saxons is the inability to psychologically and socially incorporate a fully biologized comprehension of the Norman conquest into a healthy and viable national self-image. Adapting to the harsh reality of subjugation was mollified through a general de-emphasis on a biologically based interpretations. In the end, it was also the product of an inability to explain to themselves why they accepted Norman descendants as hereditary superiors for so long. Modern Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity developed further through comparing and contrasting themselves with the conquest establishment against Norman political social superiority. Some Anglo-Saxons strived for puritanical moral superiority against Norman hereditary government. They came to define themselves as a democratic political body with a non-hereditary government. Anglo-Saxon ethnic identity became thoroughly adapted to this perception that the government is hereditarily distinct from the majority. The ethnocentric universalization of hostility. Hereditary government was ethically sublimated into the revolutionary innovations of the biologized political principles of the American Constitution. The genealogy of modern political individualism is traceable, in part, to this dearth of heredity connection between rulers and ruled in England. The individual rights interpretation obscures Anglo-Saxon history as a vanquished socio-biological body and emphasizes relative strengths. The American emphasis on the individual over kinship, ethnicity, and race continues an older Anglo-Saxon tradition of reinterpreting adaptation to ethnic defeat as a victory for individual freedom. This dodge should be recognized for what it is: from traditional evasion of that medieval drubbing at Hastings, Anglo-Saxon ethnocentrism has evolved, not only into a projection of individualism over ethnic racial identity onto other peoples, but an evasion of the import of biological factors in history. The hidden corollary of the rational progress of equal individualism is the progress of Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity. To become an American is to inherit and assimilate this selective stupidity. But it is more than that. When Germans, Vietnamese, and Haitians of either sex become Americans, they assimilate an ethnic Anglo-Saxon male pride that championed a tabula rasa self-understanding to repress the humiliation of an ancient hereditary subjugation. America is Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity taken to its logical extreme. Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity has less to do with intelligence per se, and more to do with the fact that observers who are also participants must live with their observations, and some interpretations are easier to live with than others. Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity originated in male pride. It is the stupidity of pride. This strong, politically liberal tradition stems, in part, from the problem of reconciling the past with the present it molded. As Claire Simmons wrote in Reversing the Conquest, in a society placing an increasing value upon fact, the conquest presented perhaps the greatest problem in all British history. The connotations inherent in the very word conquest clash with the image that 19th-century Britons were creating of themselves. The task, then, was to interpret the conquest as a historical corroboration of that self-image and not as a contradiction. 19th-century considerations of the events of 1066 thus become questions of how a writer treats a historical fact that fails to conform with his or her personal ideal of history. 1396. The 19th-century historian of the Norman conquest, Edward Augustus Freeman, concluded, "At home, Englishmen were neither driven out nor turned into Normans, but the Normans in England were turned into Englishmen." 1397. A miracle of Anglo-Saxon pride. How could this be possible? Such views prompted G.K. Chesterton to quip. A man may end up maintaining that the Norman conquest was a Saxon conquest. 1398. There are serious problems with Freeman's argument. The Norman conquest, after all, constituted the basis for the entire English hereditary class order. Yet Freeman's case is so notable since, in addition to being a most learned historian of the Norman conquest in the 19th century and a Saxon patriot, he was an outright racist. Despite his hereditarian inclinations, his very Saxon pride led him to temper a fully hereditarian interpretation of English class. Karl Marx's clarification of this English denial of the original biological basis of class conflict resulted in the world historical misunderstanding that helped spawn communism. For Freeman, this was not only an academic question, but a living argument that found its staunchest opponent in the Tory aristocrat John Horace Round. Freeman's adversary published a distinctly hereditarian view of the consequences of the conquest in 1892. Geoffrey de Mandeville was the first systematic application of genealogical study to political history. 1399. This Essex landowner of Norman origin, d. 1144, must have had more than academic interest for its author, since Round himself came from a landed family of Essex. 1400. The argument between Freeman and Round is a classic example of polarization in the debate on the Norman conquest. Yet how can objectivity be maintained if there is a socio-biological basis for one's position on the nature-nurture question? Note that the possibility of turning Normans into Englishmen is similar to an issue that divides the French and the Germans. Charlemagne was king of the Franks, the Germanic tribe that conquered the land still named after them. Was Charlemagne, Karl der Grosse in German, a Frenchman or a German? Should I bother to ask who is right? The German interpretation implies the greater import of heredity over culture. The French interpretation implies the greater import of culture over heredity. These incompatible interpretations continued into incompatible interpretations of the French Revolution, with some partial exceptions, such as Napoleon, see Déjà Vu? Yet was Clovis, c. 466. 511, the leader of the original Frankish conquest, of Frenchman Anglo-Saxon conquest through culture against Norman conquest through genealogy also underlies the possibility of assimilation to Americanism. If Normans in England were turned into Englishmen, as Freeman maintained, then what about Irish? What about the Italians? What about the Chinese? American affirmation of the possibilities of assimilation is rooted in an old Anglo-Saxon belief or hope that they conquered the Normans by assimilating them. There is cunning to be found in this Anglo-Saxon selective stupidity, for here one can see a blueprint for Anglo-Saxon cultural conquest. America is obviously not largely Anglo-Saxon in racial terms, but just as some hope to fight Norman genealogical imperialism with Saxon cultural imperialism, the universalization of this more low-key proposition justified a cultural way of conquest. Be it Anglo-American culture or the spreading of democracy itself, conquest through Saxonization is part of the American way.